Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling this court case that I think is really gets you thinking. It's about the former Washington State University football coach, Nick Rolovich, his refusal to get the COVID-19 vaccine, and all the fallout from that like landed him in court.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating case. It really kind of puts a spotlight on that tension between individual religious freedom and, an employer's responsibility to have a safe and healthy workplace for everyone.
Exactly. And our primary source today is going to be the U.S. District Court ruling itself. It just came out on January 6th, 2025. So this is like hot off the press stuff, straight to the source.
Yeah,
No.
secondhand interpretations here.
No, we're going right to the source. And, this case, I think it's about way more than just this one coach or even just college football. I mean, it really grapples with these huge questions about religious exemptions and vaccine mandates and how those two things kind of like run into each other sometimes.
Yeah, and it really gets into like the legal weeds of what undue hardship really means for an employer. And that's often like the make it or break it point in these cases. And this ruling has some pretty interesting insights into how courts are thinking about that whole concept.
Okay, so before we like get into all the legal mumbo jumbo, let's just like set
Yeah.
the stage. Back in December 2021, Rolovich was fired from WSU for not complying with the state's COVID-19 vaccine mandate for employees. And I mean, head coaches don't get fired every day, so this was a pretty big deal right from the
Oh,
start.
absolutely. It was huge.
Yeah.
And, you got to remember, this was all happening when the pandemic was like still front and center in everyone's minds, and vaccine mandates were like this super hot button issue. So Rolovich's firing, and it really like poured gasoline on that fire, Yeah. and it sparked all these debates about personal liberty, government overreach, the role of science and public policy. It's a very intense atmosphere.
Yeah, for sure. So Rolovich, he applied for a religious exemption, but the university denied it. And that denial basically like set the stage for this whole lawsuit that he filed back in 2022. And ultimately, that lawsuit was about challenging his firing.
Right. And it wasn't just about the vaccine itself. His lawsuit was saying that WSU violated his rights under both federal and state laws that protect against religious discrimination in employment. But on top of that, he also argued that WSU breached his contract and improperly withheld wages. So he was really like coming at this from every angle, legally speaking.
Sounds like he was like throwing the whole legal playbook at them.
Oh yeah, he's pulling out all the stops.
So to understand like what the court decided, we need to sort of like dive into how the law works in these religious accommodation cases.
Exactly. And, a lot of times these cases, they really hinge on what they call a burden shifting framework. It's like a back and forth between the employee and the employer. Each side has to prove certain things.
Okay, so walk me through this like legal dance. What does each side have to prove?
So first, it's the employee's turn. They have to show they have a sincere religious belief, like a real, genuine belief that clashes with a specific rule at work. It can't just be like, oh, I don't like this rule or I don't agree with this. It has to be something deeper, tied to their religion.
So it has to be more than just a personal preference or just like a philosophical objection, right? It has to be something that's like a deeply held religious thing.
Right, exactly. And here's where it gets interesting. Once the employee shows they have that sincere religious belief and that it conflicts with work, the ball is in the employer's court.
Okay, so then what does the employer have to do?
Now, the employer, they have to either figure out a way to accommodate that belief, maybe change some work duties or offer something different, or they have to prove that doing any of that would just cause them too much trouble, what they call undue hardship.
And I'm guessing that undue hardship idea, that's where things get really messy, right? Legally speaking.
You got it. Because it's not just about things being a little inconvenient or costing the employer a bit more money. It has to be something big, something that would really mess up how the business runs or cause other serious problems. And figuring out exactly where that line is, well, the courts have really struggled with that.
So in Rolovich's case, did the court agree with him? Did they say that WSU messed up by not accommodating his decision to not get vaccinated?
Well, the court's decision this past January, it was a big nope. Judge Thomas O. Rice, he ruled against Rolovich on everything.
Wow, so like a total loss for Rolovich then.
Yeah, pretty much. And the judge's reasoning, that's where it gets really interesting. He didn't really focus on whether Rolovich's specific beliefs were like valid or mainstream enough. He looked more at whether those beliefs were sincere and consistent based on what Rolovich did and said.
So the court was like looking deeper, beyond just what Rolovich said, right? They were looking for proof to back it up. What kind of proof did the judge consider in this case?
That's what makes this case so interesting. The judge actually pointed out times when Rolovich talked about the vaccine. And it sounded more like he was worried about like regular stuff, not religious stuff. Like he apparently told family and friends about reasons he didn't want the vaccine that had nothing to do with religion. And that made the judge wonder if Rolovich's objection was really about religion at all.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's one thing to say something's against your religion, but it's different if you're acting like it's about something else entirely.
Exactly. And the judge didn't stop there. He also looked at the fact that Rolovich wouldn't even wear a mask, even during team meetings and games.
So the judge wasn't just looking at like one moment in time, he was looking at the whole picture of how Rolovich was acting. I'm guessing that whole mask thing, that played into the undue hardship part of the argument?
Bingo. The judge saw that refusal to wear a mask as proof that Rolovich not being vaccinated could cause problems for the university. I mean, think about it. His job as head coach meant being around tons of people all the time. Players, staff, fans. It's hard to avoid close contact in that role.
Yeah, it sounds like the judge wasn't just thinking about Rolovich by himself. He was thinking about how Rolovich's actions could affect the whole university.
Exactly. He was looking at the bigger picture. And he even mentioned other things that could be a hardship for WSU, like if they had to pay more for travel because of Rolovich's vaccination status, things like that.
So undue hardship, it's not only about money, is it?
Nope, not at all. It's a much bigger idea. The judge even talked about how WSU's reputation could be hurt, and they could lose donors if they kept Rolovich as coach. It was just too controversial.
It sounds like the judge was saying that undue hardship can be about all sorts of things, not just the obvious ones.
Right, and that's what makes this ruling so important. Because this case, it might come up in other cases about religious exemptions, not just for vaccines, but for other stuff at work too. It gives us a peek into how courts might decide if someone's religious objection is really real, and what things they think about when deciding if something's an undue hardship.
We're back. And I'm still kind of wrapping my head around how much this Rolovich case touches on. It's like this one legal fight is bringing up all these different parts of our society, like individual rights, public health, and how we figure out those situations where different values are like bumping into each other.
Yeah, it really does. And it's fascinating how, even though this ruling is just for this one case, this one place, it could have a much bigger impact. Like it's giving us this look into how courts are dealing with these situations where people's beliefs clash with what their job wants them to do. And we're seeing more and more of those conflicts, especially after COVID.
It's like this case is saying, hey, this is how we're thinking about this stuff now. So for people trying to figure out their own rights or what their job can ask them to do, this case is like a bit of a guide, right?
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't mean every case will turn out the same, of course. But it does give us some hints about which arguments might work and which ones won't. And one big takeaway here is the importance of evidence. Both sides, the employee and the employer, they need to be ready to back up what they're saying.
So for someone who is asking for a religious exemption, it's not enough to just say it. You need to be able to prove it.
Right. You need to show not just that you have the belief, but how it connects to your religion and why it really prevents you from doing what your job asks. Like, are there any writings from your religion that talk about this? What do your religious leaders say? Is there anything that explains why you object? You need to gather anything you can to support your request.
It's almost like you're putting together a legal case, like a lawyer would.
Yeah, kind of. You're giving evidence, just like in court. And consistency is super important. If you're saying you can't get a vaccine because of your religion, but then you're online talking about other reasons you don't like vaccines, that doesn't look good. Like in the Rolovich case, the court is going to see if what you say matches what you do.
It's about actually living by those beliefs, not just saying you do.
Exactly. And don't wait till the last minute to tell your boss. Be proactive, Talk to them early on, be respectful, and be ready to have a real conversation trying to find a solution.
That makes sense. Okay, so let's switch sides. Let's say you're the boss and someone asks for a religious exemption. What do you need to keep in mind, legally speaking?
The biggest thing is to take the request seriously. You can't just have a rule of saying no to all religious exemptions. That's discrimination, and it can get you in trouble.
So you can't just say, nope, our policy is no exemptions, end of story.
No way. Not if you want to avoid lawsuits. You have to really try to see if there's anything you can do to accommodate the person. Could you change their hours? Let them work from home. Maybe change some of their tasks. There might be some creative solutions out there.
So it's about being flexible and trying to find something that works for everyone?
Yeah, exactly. But like we saw with Rolovich, sometimes there's just no way to accommodate someone without causing major problems for the employer.
And that's where I bet it gets really complicated. How do you decide if something is really a big enough hardship to say no to the request?
That's the question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no simple answer. It all depends on the details of the situation.
So there's no like magic formula or rule that employers can just follow.
I wish there was. But the courts have given us some things to think about, like how much will it cost to accommodate the person, both in terms of money and how much it disrupts the business. How big is the company? What resources do they have? Will it affect other workers? Will it make things harder for everyone? Are there safety risks? You got to consider all of this stuff very carefully.
It sounds like you really have to weigh a lot of different things.
Yep, it's a balancing act for sure. You're trying to balance the person's religious freedom with the company's need to do business and keep everyone safe.
And this just shows how important that documentation is that we were talking about earlier. Employers need to keep good records of everything, like all their conversations, any ideas they had about accommodating the person and why they made the decision they made.
Absolutely. If the case goes to court, those records are super important to show that the employer did things the right way.
This has been such a helpful conversation, I think. We've covered a lot, from the details of the Rolovich case to those big questions about religious freedom, public health, and what employees and employers can and should do.
And one thing that really stands out is that this part of the law is always changing. As we deal with new things like pandemics, new technology, and how society changes, the law has to change too.
So if people want to stay up to date and make sure they're not breaking any rules, what should they do?
Well, don't just listen to what people are saying online or what your friends tell you. Go to reliable sources for legal advice. Places like legal aid organizations, advocacy groups, or government agencies that focus on employment law. And if it's a really tricky situation, talking to a lawyer is always a good idea.
Great advice. And as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, I think it's good to remember that this whole thing is about trying to find a balance between individual rights and what's good for the community as a whole.
You said it. We live in a world where people have all sorts of different beliefs and values. Figuring out how to respect those differences while still working together to make a fair and safe society, well, that's one of those important things we got to do.
Couldn't agree more. And for everyone listening, this case reminds us to really think about these issues, to stay informed, and to talk to each other respectfully, even when it's hard. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll be right back after a quick break.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been digging into this really interesting court case, with the former WSU coach, Nick Rolovich, and his refusal to get the COVID vaccine, and of course, the legal fight that came after.
Yeah, it's a case that seems like it's still kind of unfolding even as we're talking about it. Brings up so many questions about individual rights and what employers have to do and how we handle these situations where someone's beliefs clash with what their job wants, especially during something like a public health crisis. Exactly. And, before the break, we were talking about like the practical side of all this. So like, let's say you're in a similar situation. Maybe you're the employee who needs a religious exemption, or maybe you're the employer trying to figure out how to handle those requests. What are some things to keep in mind? What can you do to make sure you're doing things right, legally speaking?
It all comes down to being prepared and knowing what's what. So let's start with the employee. If you're the one who needs that religious exemption, documentation is key. It's like your best friend in this situation.
So it's not enough to just tell your boss, hey, my religion says no can do. You need to have something more, right? Like some kind of proof.
Right. You got to be able to explain what your belief is and how it truly conflicts with whatever your job is asking you to do. Like, are there any writings in your religion that talk about this? What do your religious leaders say about it? Can you show anything that explains why you can't do this? Gather as much as you can to support what you're asking for.
It's almost like you're building a legal case, isn't it?
It kind of is. You're basically presenting evidence, just like you would in court. And being consistent is really important too. Like, if you're saying you can't get a vaccine for religious reasons, but then you're on social media talking about how you don't trust vaccines for other reasons, that can hurt your case. The court, like we saw with Rolovich, they're going to look at if your actions match up with what you're saying.
It's like you got to walk the walk, not just talk the talk, right?
Exactly. And don't wait till the last minute to tell your boss about this. Be proactive, talk to them early, be respectful, and be ready to have a conversation and try to find a solution together.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, so let's switch it up. Now you're the employer, and someone comes to you asking for a religious exemption. Legally, what are the most important things to remember?
The first thing is you got to take the request seriously. You can't just automatically say no to all religious exemptions. That's discrimination, plain and simple. and it can get you into legal trouble.
So you can't just say, sorry, no exemptions. That's the rule.
Nope. Not if you want to stay out of court. You have to make a real effort to see if there's any way you can accommodate the person. Like, can you change their schedule? Can they work from home? Maybe change some of their tasks. Think outside the box. There might be some creative solutions you can come up with.
So it's about being flexible and trying to find a way that works for both sides.
Exactly. But, like we saw with Rolovich, sometimes accommodating someone's beliefs just creates too many problems for the employer. There's just no way around it.
And I bet that's where it gets really tough. How do you decide what crosses that line? When does it become a real hardship for the employer?
That is the big question. And honestly, there's no easy answer. Every case is different. It all depends on the specifics.
So there's no rule book or formula that employers can just follow.
I wish there was. But the courts have given us some things to think about. Like, how much will it cost to accommodate the person? Not just money, but how much will it disrupt everything? How big is the company? What resources do they have? How will it affect the other workers? Will it make things harder for everyone to do their jobs? Are there safety risks? It's a lot to consider.
Yeah, sounds like a real balancing act.
It is.
Yeah.
You're trying to balance the employee's right to their beliefs with the company's need to, actually run the business and keep everyone safe.
And this just goes back to what we were saying before about keeping good records. Employers, they need to write everything down. All their conversations, all the ideas they had about accommodating the person, and the reasons why they made the decisions they made.
That's right. Because if it ends up in court, those records can really help the employer show that they did things the right way.
Well, I gotta say, this has been a really eye-opening conversation. We've talked about so much, from the Rolovich case itself to these bigger issues about religious freedom, public health, and what both sides, the employees and the employers, need to know.
And I think one of the big things we've learned is that this area of the law, it's not set in stone, It's constantly changing. As we face new things like pandemics, new technology, and how society is changing, the laws have to change too.
So how can people stay in the loop, How can they make sure they're on the right side of the law?
Well, don't just take legal advice from what you hear from other people or what you see online. Go to sources you can trust, like legal aid groups, advocacy organizations, or government agencies that deal with employment law. And if it's a really complicated situation, talking to a lawyer is always a good idea.
Great advice. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to remember that this all boils down to finding that balance. Finding that balance between individual rights and what's good for the community as a whole.
Absolutely. We live in a world with so many different beliefs and values. Figuring out how to respect each other and work together to make a society that's both safe and fair, well, that's one of the most important challenges we face.
Well said. And for everyone listening, this case, it's a reminder to think about these issues, to stay informed, and to talk to each other with respect, even when it's tough. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep those minds working.